Hello and welcome to the Starting Necron series, where we go from your first purchase to your first 2000 point army list and everything in between for the Necron army. In this video we'll take a look at the various dynasty options for the Necrons and how they function on the tabletop. There are two types of dynasties, the first being one of 6 traditional dynasties that give world buffs, a unique stratagem, a unique warlord trait, and a unique relic. The second type gives you access to a slew of different world buffs from 2 different tables that you can mix and match to create your own dynasty. Both are good options and offer their own pros and cons, but it's important to note that some characters require certain dynasties, so if you want to take them you'll have to go into that dynasty to some extent. You can always take a small or auxiliary detachment to fit that character in without being completely forced into that dynasty. However, in some cases, if a character has buffs that require other units, you will be forced to take more of that dynasty instead of just the character. The first 3 dynasties we'll take a look at are the dynasties that are seeing the most play currently and placed within the top 4 of various tournaments that occurred. Keep in mind that we have seen far less events than normal since 9th edition has released, and 9th is still a rather new edition, so we may very well see other dynasties coming into play as the edition evolves. Additionally, this is based off of 2000 point games, so certain dynasties may do better at smaller games or mid-sized games than the dynasties listed here, so keep that in mind as certain things change depending on the game size. And before we start looking at the dynasties, I'll say this right away, as I'm not particularly great with names, I'll probably get a lot of the names wrong, so I'm just going to address that right away and say, hey, laugh at me if I get them wrong. The first dynasty we'll look at today is the Szarkhan Dynasty, as this is the most popular dynasty currently within tournament play. And to be upfront with this, the real reason this is the most popular dynasty isn't necessarily because it's the strongest dynasty, but rather because it's a dynasty that includes the supreme command character known as Szarkhan the Silent King. And Szarkhan is an absolute beast of a unit, however he does cost 450 points and requires the supreme command attachment. As such, he's not playable within combat patrol, and even on 2000 point games he is about 25% of your army, which makes him a rather huge investment. However, he does see play in a lot of the tournament lists currently, which is why his dynasty is as popular as it is. However, even taking that into account, not every list that has been a Szarkhan list has specifically only included him and taken other dynasty choices, but rather there has been at least one instance of a list using an entire Szarkhan dynasty instead of just being Szarkhan plus other dynasties. So let's take a look at what the Szarkhan dynasty offers. To begin, all of the standard 6 dynasties offer 3 to 4 buffs in the name of codes. Each of these buffs extends to dynasty units as a whole and augments them in certain ways. Usually one of these 3 is rather strong, with one of them being okay, and then the third one usually buffing protocols, which isn't as important. The first part of the Szarkhan code is that the code gives your units a 5+ feel no pain save against mortal wound attacks, and while this doesn't sound too potent, you do have to remember that mortal wounds are becoming more and more popular within the game, and in addition to that, certain phases like the psychic phase do not benefit from reanimation protocols, and a lot of times you'll see a lot of mortal wounds within that psychic phase. So in a lot of ways this increases the survivability more than you would actually assume, as it allows you to kind of get a little more resilience against those parts of the game where you might have a little bit of difficulty otherwise. And as we continue seeing mortal wounds becoming more and more prevalent, having protection against them will become more relevant, and this buff can actually gain power if mortal wounds continue on the trajectory of being as important as they currently are within the game. The second code benefit you get from the Szarkhan dynasty is every time a unit would shoot or fight, you get to reroll on a wound roll. And one thing to point out about this is on a single roll, not on a single unit. So when this happens, you only get to reroll 1 roll, and this is actually a rather weak ability, and considering this is a throw-in ability, it's not necessarily bad, and it's definitely a nice little extra perk to have. It's great on smaller unit sizes and individual characters. However, many Necron units prefer to go larger instead of smaller, so it is a little bit awkward in that sense. Finally, the third code benefit is normally one that's kind of irrelevant, considering it gives you a benefit to your protocols, and what it does is it lets you use both parts of the protocol when it becomes active. Usually this is a bit of a pain to set up, and usually both parts of the protocol being active are not as important as just picking one that's vital to that turn. So there's a lot of setup, and it only affects one of the protocols to begin with, making it a bit awkward. Not only that, but you have to remember that you have to have a character within 6 inches of a unit, and protocols are preset to some extent, and also all of the units in the army, with the exception of units that can't have a code in the codex, need to have the same code, so it will not work if you try to have different dynasty detachments, meaning that a lot of times when you want to take different attachments, you can't if you want to benefit from this protocol buff. So most of the time you're not really going to care about the protocol part of the dynasty code. However, when you do get it, it's a nice little perk to have. For the Szarkhan, the protocol is Undying Legion, which heals 1 additional wound from living metal. And the second part of the protocol is that you can reroll 1 die when rerolling reanimation protocols for each unit that makes a reanimation protocol reroll. This is a perfectly fine ability if you just happen to benefit from it. Again, it's only really going to last one turn, and it's only going to matter if there's a character within 6 inches of the units you want to benefit from this. So there's a lot that goes into setting this up. Most of the time, you're really not going to care about setting this up to benefit you unless the stars kind of align. So whenever you see a part of the code that benefits a protocol, just consider it as an extra bonus that sometimes might do something as opposed to something you should build around or warp your army around, because the majority of the games you play, this isn't going to have a major effect, but rather it might give you a very marginal buff. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, the 6 named dynasties all have additional perks in addition to their code buffs. The first one of those additional perks being the stratagem. Szarkhan has a rather powerful stratagem, being Empiric Dampening. What it does is, for 1 command point, if you have a Szarkhan model within 18 inches of an enemy psyker, you can roll a d6 and deny their psychic power on a 4+. This is a rather powerful ability, as Necrons don't have much interaction with the psychic phase, and a lot of psychic powers are rather powerful. It's important to use this wisely, as an opponent can try to bait you with weaker powers before using a vital one that you really need to deny. Even then, we've seen similar stratagems such as this within armies that also have very few interaction options with psychers, and it's been enough for those armies to take a certain amount of those units in order to have that interaction. So as far as things go, this is one of those things that would probably push you towards taking some Szarkhan units. So all of a sudden, not only do you get to interact with a part of the game you don't really normally get to, in the form of that feel no pain against mortal wounds, but you also get this ability to deny psychic powers potentially. Following the stratagem, there is a special warlord trait, and the special warlord trait for this dynasty is Triarch's Will. It allows it to pick 4 protocols instead of 5, and then double up on one of the protocols. It's not the worst, but the generic traits such as Enduring Will generally beat it out very easily. Maybe it would be okay as an extra trait off of a stratagem that lets you take an extra trait, but it's still rather mediocre, and remember, the Necrons are limited to only taking 1 extra trait total, and they cannot take a bunch of them like some armies can. So generally as a whole, you're not going to worry about this trait so much because it's going to get beaten out by other ones. However, there might be cases where you do want the protocols to be active 2 turns in a row or something like that, so keep that in mind when building a list, because there might be situations where you can make use of this where other players haven't, and it could do something that surprises a lot of people. Now, before we look at the special relics, I'm going to say right now that the generic relics are generally going to beat out most of the special relics due to the fact that there's a relic called Veil of Darkness, which is rather strong because it gives incredible mobility to some of your units, and pretty much you're always going to take a Veil of Darkness as your first relic, and then you have the option of buying an additional relic with command points. However, Veil of Darkness is not the only strong relic within the generic relics, as something like Voltaic Staff is an incredibly powerful weapon. So generally you're going to see Veil of Darkness because the 9th edition mobility is king, and you're usually going to see something like Voltaic Staff as a second relic because it's just a very powerful weapon. So to look at the relic for the Szarkhan dynasty, the relic is called Sovereign Coronal, and the ability isn't terrible, but it's definitely a hard sell compared to the other relics we've mentioned already. This relic has 2 parts and both benefit protocols. The first half is that the bearer extends their protocol aura from 6 inches to 9 inches, and the second being that both protocol parts are active for Szarkhan models within 9 inches of the bearer. Having both protocol parts active isn't super relevant, and even though the 9 inches is nice, you generally don't want to warp your army around protocol specifically because you're going to have a hard time making the most out of it. So in reality, unless you're doing something very special with that warlord trait, I'd say try to avoid this one because Veil of Darkness and Voltaic Staff are just better and easier to use as a whole. So to wrap up what the Szarkhan dynasty offers, it offers a lot of defensive benefits against things like mortal wounds and psychers, which is something that the Necron army doesn't really have a lot of, and it has a major powerhouse of a character known as the Silent King, which is probably what makes this dynasty as popular as it is, because if you discount the fact that Zarek the Silent King sees so much play, this dynasty really has only made marginal impressions within the tournament scene without including him as representative of this dynasty. Still, it's pretty good, and I can definitely see a situation in which you take a small detachment or an auxiliary unit of Szarkhan models just so you have the ability to interact with enemy psychers with that Szarkhan stratagem, because it is a rather powerful ability. The second dynasty on the list, and probably the first in raw power if the Silent King was not an option, is a custom dynasty. As mentioned already, custom dynasties pick 1 buff from 2 different lists and gain both those. Generally, the core dynasties will have 1 powerful ability and then 2 mediocre ones, with the protocol ability being incredibly incredibly mediocre, as they also gain access to the special benefits like the special stratagem, relic, and trait, while the custom dynasties will have 2 strong buffs and will have no special additional benefits. And while I'm not really going to go over any other custom dynasty combinations, in this case, this one has been incredibly prevalent to the point where it might actually see a nerf in the future, as every Necron list has been trending towards this dynasty, and while I don't think it's necessarily broken, it is incredibly strong and incredibly annoying to play against, so I can see them trying to do something to scale this one back a little bit to allow a little more diversity within the Necron forces, especially if we continue seeing the dominance of this custom dynasty continue. The custom dynasty that is probably the strongest of all the options is a mix of Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists. The Eternal Conquerors buff gives all of your units objective secured, with units that already have objective secured counting as double for objective secured purposes. The Relentless Expansionist part gives your units the ability to move 6 inches before the first round of the game. As mentioned before, objectives and mobility are key to the 9th edition. With Necrons having decent damage output and survivability as a whole, they can easily take advantage of the mobility and objective holding that this custom dynasty offers. The pre-first round move is a great ability for not only advancing onto objectives, but also for hedging your bets during deployment, as you can pretty much move all of your army 6 inches before the first round begins, and as such you can deploy with the assumption of going first or second, while still having the ability to course correct if you don't get the turn order that you're hoping for, and if you do happen to get the desired results of turn order that you wanted, it allows you to double down into your game plan. So that really gives you a major advantage in terms of positioning that many armies have difficulty achieving on their own. More so seeing as the OBSEC stacks with existing OBSEC, it's a combination that's great with normal troop heavy lists as well as elite lists. In some cases, lists running this combination ran a Vanguard and Outrider detachment, not taking any troops but going heavy on Scorpic Destroyers, Canoptic Wraiths, Scarabs, and Canoptic Spiders. In other cases, lists ran a rather normal Necron Warrior spam build, while others went even further with Immortals or Ghost Arcs and everything in between. Many of these lists also include a Silent King, although in his own Supreme Command detachment and in his mandatory dynasty. So as a whole, this is the best choice for a solid overall dynasty that plays into the primary focus of 9th edition, as it takes the good parts of Necrons and adds to it. As the edition evolves, we may see more of a mix of dynasties, but as it stands, this is by far the vast majority of the field currently, and it's not a broken choice like I said, but rather it's incredibly powerful in a developing meta. I will say that I kind of like this combination, even though it's incredibly annoying to play against, because it hasn't necessarily dominated the tournament scene, and it has given a lot of Necron units the ability to see some play, whereas they might otherwise not see it, because having all of your units be objective secured is incredibly strong, though I do feel a little bit conflicted about that because it does kind of edge out the other dynasties. However, as we're still seeing some of the other dynasties make appearances, and I think that in the future we might even see more dynasties making an appearance that we haven't seen so far, I think as long as this doesn't become an oppressive force within the game and it doesn't become a situation where this is the only dynasty you see, I think it's okay for the time being. For the 3rd dynasty, we'll look at the Novokh Dynasty. This dynasty has seen some minor success, but it definitely seems like one of the ones that can be rather good, but might also see a little bit of a drop-off as the meta settles down. This is because this is a very aggressive dynasty that wants to engage in combat, and such strategies always do well very early on within a meta, as they can catch people off guard. More so 9th edition benefited these types of strategies because of a big shift that happened where shooting became less powerful and engagement became more powerful thanks to the focus on terrain, objectives, and smaller table sizes, so it's unlikely that this is going to see a major drop-off unless something changes to allow more shooting armies to become a little stronger. However, again, remember, aggressive strategies do have certain limitations and usually become a little weaker as people figure out more ways to deal with them, as well as how to play the different objectives a little more, where they might be able to keep people from engaging onto them. Looking at the code buffs that Novokh offers, the first benefit it offers is you add 1 to the charge rolls made for units with this code. This is pretty good as it benefits mobility, and mobility is very important in 9. While a pre-first turn 6-inch move gives you more movement overall, being able to make a charge is major for any assault army, as failing to charge can easily leave a unit stranded and destroyed before it can accomplish anything. The second part of the code benefits from the first, as when a unit charges, is charged, or makes a heroic intervention, it gains 1 additional armor penetration for that turn. This both makes your units deadlier in combat when they engage an enemy, as well as deterring preventing enemies from charging them. One additional armor penetration isn't always the most important, but it's a great boost when it's essentially a free ability, as the second ability of the code tends to be the weaker one. The protocol benefit of the Novokh Dynasty is Hungry Void. This gives you 1 additional armor penetration when you roll an unmodified 6 to wound with any of your models benefiting from this protocol, and the second part being you gain 1 strength when making a charge while this is active. While this protocol is a little bit harder to set up than most, it's definitely one that can do a lot of work when things fall into place, especially when it stacks with other parts of the dynasty. Treat this as a perk that's cool when it happens, but not something you build around or need to focus on, just like with all of the other dynasty protocol buffs. The special stratagem is fantastic, as it gives Novokh models in a single unit +1 attack in the fight phase for only 1 command point. On units with only 1 attack, this doubles the number of attacks they have, and while that's not usually an optimal way of using it, it definitely adds up very quickly when you use it on a huge 20 model unit of Necron warriors, and all of them are all of a sudden getting 2 attacks each. However, you can also use it on rather strong units such as Scorpic destroyers, who for every 3 models go from 11 attacks to 14 attacks, which is almost like having an extra invisible Scorpic destroyer for every 3 Scorpic destroyers you have, which is rather strong. Additionally, in some cases, you might even use this on a single model, because even though that's kind of a corner case, there might be a situation where you're in combat with someone and you're using something like the Honorable Combat Warlord trait in order to take out a character, and you absolutely need that 1 extra attack. And all this is possible because this is only 1 command point, so the versatility of the stratagem is actually rather high, and it's rather powerful all things considered. Even on something like Flayed Ones, this might be kind of interesting because they can fight twice, and if you use the fight twice stratagem, giving them 1 extra attack means that they essentially get 2 extra attacks. However, Flayed Ones are kind of a weak unit, so I don't really see this happening too much, because usually you're just going to be taking things like Scorpic Destroyers, Scorpic Destroyer Lords, and Canoptic Wraiths, and things like that within a melee army. But who knows, maybe Flayed Ones do become better in the future. The special Novokh Warlord trait is called Blood Fueled Fury. This lets the Warlord score an additional mortal wound when making a wound roll of 6. I can see a world where this is taken on something like a Scorpic Lord due to his Flensing Claws, but is it really better than Enduring Will or Honorable Combat? I'm not really sure if it is, and honestly I don't think it is. In most cases, I'd just rather have it Enduring Will or Honorable Combat, because you're really only going to generate maybe 1, maybe 2 mortal wounds off of this. For the relic, Novokh gains a really interesting one, which is called the Blood Scythe. This is a beefed up war scythe that has the same stats, but gives the wielder 2 extra attacks. This relic has to replace a Void Scythe or a War Scythe, so keep that in mind. I can see this seeing some action as a second relic, since you pretty much always take a Veil of Darkness as the first one. The bigger limitation is that the models that do carry a scythe weapon that this can replace are less popular than the ones that carry a Staff of Light currently, which can be replaced with the relic Voltaic Staff that is also rather strong. So it really comes down to a question of which one are you more likely to see, and currently I would say the Voltaic Staff is going to be a lot more likely to be your choice over the Blood Scythe, which is a little bit unfortunate because this does seem like a really interesting relic otherwise. As a whole, Novokh is probably the strongest melee focused dynasty, as each ability benefits its combat, as well as a stratagem that can be incredibly powerful in the right situations. Unlike some dynasties, everything in this dynasty kind of works together to give you a lot more of an ability to not only engage in melee combat, but to also overwhelm your opponents once you're in melee combat. Though you might be able to splash this dynasty, this is definitely one that's going to be more of a core component of your army if you take it, than one that you take a few units on and just take the stratagem. However, there might be some justification for mixing and matching, because that extra attack off the stratagem is very strong. Now that we've covered the top 3 dynasties, I think this will be a good stopping point, because this video is getting rather long, and if I continue as we're going now, this is going to end up being an incredibly long video. So in this case, we'll stop with these top 3, and we'll continue in the next video with the remaining dynasties, and in that video we'll take a look at how certain dynasties can break into the tournament scene and what makes some of the lower dynasties rank where they are, because it's kind of interesting to see that some of them just don't really make the cut even though they have rather strong abilities. Anyway, if you've enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you think someone would benefit from either this guide or another one of the army guides that I made, do share the videos as it helps other players out. And as always, thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.